Last week, we stopped right before we were in this section where Peter's declaration about Jesus. We'd read 27 through 30. Jesus has told them, once Peter gave the strong statement about who Jesus is, then Jesus began to tell them what the Messiah would have to suffer. Let me just read that passage, and we'll go from there. It's in verse 31. It says, "Then Jesus began to tell them that the Son of Man must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders and the leading priests and the teachers of the religious law. He would be killed, but 3 days later he would rise from the dead." We talked about all of that, did we not? We did talk about that, okay, because I remember talking about that. And then it says, as he talked about this openly with his disciples, Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. And Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples, then reprimanded Peter. "Get away from me, Satan," he said. "You are seeing things merely from a human point of view and not from God's." The words that come right after Jesus had said what would be happening to him, it says, as he talked openly about this with his disciples. That really, literally, essentially in the Greek, what it says is, and openly the word he spoke. And openly the word he spoke. The word is parousia, and it comes from a noun that means to be courageous, or to be bold, or to be frank about something. It means here, essentially, that his speech became direct and open and revealing. And Jesus, he was plain and clear. And this is an important point, because he'd been somewhat vague in certain things. He'd been telling parables. He'd been telling people to keep things to yourself. And all of a sudden, it's just like he switches completely into saying things that are just short and to the point. Can you imagine I can't even imagine how he said, well, and the Son of Man must be persecuted, and the Son of Man must be crucified, and he's going to die. I mean, he's just saying like that. And this whole thing, as plainly as he was speaking, caught the disciples off guard. They got caught off guard by this. Peter's confession made it possible. Once Peter had said, "You are the Messiah, the Christ," then it made it possible for Jesus to speak about who he was more boldly, because up to that point he was just hoping they'd catch it. And so that's where we are. And the one thing that I know is this, that though the disciples did not fully understand what it meant for Jesus to be the Messiah, they knew exactly what he was talking about when he said he was going to be persecuted and crucified and he's going to die and rise again. That all didn't confuse them at all. And they didn't agree with it one bit. Not a bit. This was like Jesus is off the rails. He's off the rails because they had in their mind absolutely everything that they thought was coming. And in the end, they all thought they were going to be sitting on thrones up on some big podium with Jesus ruling everything, and that they weren't. This was just, wait a minute, Jesus, this is crazy. I've got three things that I thought about it quite a bit, and I was thinking that there were three things that they thought that Jesus needed help with. One was that either Jesus didn't know what was coming, and he was responding out of confusion and fear, and he just had seen the stuff going on, and he was just like, oh, these people are going to get me. And they didn't want, no, Jesus, that's stupid. Don't think about that. Or that Jesus didn't know what the role of the Messiah was. It was like as if Jesus hadn't been listening when all the rabbis had been talking and people had been talking around a fire and stuff like that. Jesus had been preoccupied with whatever he was up to, and he just didn't know. No, Jesus, that's not going to happen to you. You're going to do this and this and this and this and this, and it's going to be good for you. Or, and I think I mentioned this before, that the disciples might have been thinking, okay, yeah, it's possible that somebody might not like Jesus and go after him, but we're going to take care of him. We're going to stand with him, and we're going to be brave, and we're going to fight for him, and all of that stuff. And we know how that one went down, don't we? When push came to shove. Remember, the normal pattern is for the disciple or a rabbi to be there. The disciples are to stay back here, and when they're walking in, the rabbi's out there. So they're back behind him, talking amongst themselves like, Peter, you need to talk to him about this. You need to fix this one. Because, and then they could have said, well, he just doesn't know what's coming. Or, you need to tell him that we're going to take care of him. One of the other Gospels says that Peter goes up to him. It says it took him aside and began to reprimand him in our version. That word that gives us reprimand is a lot stronger than reprimand. That word, actually, the word, it's epitemon, I think I should look at it, but it's a rebuke that is presumptuous and should never be allowed, is what it is. A rebuke that is presumptuous and never be allowed. Now, Peter had seen Jesus take people off to the side and do stuff over to the side a number of times. And so he does it again. He takes him, Peter does what Jesus did. He took him off to the side and to talk to him. But that doesn't mean Peter was the only one involved in it. I'm sure that they had said, Peter, you go talk to him. So he takes him off to the side so that what? Jesus will not be seen publicly being reprimanded or told. In another gospel, it says that Peter went up to him and said, it's like, oh no, Lord, this certainly will never happen to you. The next line is pretty amazing. It says that, can you put the next verse up? It says, and Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples. Now, why would he need to turn around and look at his disciples? Main reason is because they're all in on the thing. They've all talked about it. He knows that Peter's not alone in this. Now, here's the reason this is so strong. Do you remember when we talked about Jesus said that these things must happen? These things have to happen. That the Son of Man has to be taken advantage of by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. And he has to be crucified. And he has to be killed. And then he has to rise from the dead. And we said that this is all what? God's will. God's plan. And what Peter is offering Jesus is an opportunity to skip all that other stuff. Yeah, he's going to rise again and come in power and all that stuff, but Peter is offering him a chance to skip all the rough stuff and just go right to the power part. Just go right to the kingdom part. And that is a temptation. And who tempted Jesus by offering him the world if he would just, what? Not follow God's will, but bow down to Satan and give his will over to Satan. Remember that part? When Peter was preaching this, he didn't give any details to Mark for Mark to know exactly what he was saying. We don't have what he said. We just know that Jesus turned around and he said, "Get away from me, Satan. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view. and not from God's. And we need to break that out. Now, the first part actually, it's more like, it's literally like, you go or you get behind me. Okay? You go and get behind me. Now, there are two thoughts about this, and I just want to say this passage has made people, commentators in particular, really nervous about things, because here's Jesus calling Peter Satan. Okay? Like, what's that about? What's Jesus calling Peter Satan about? We got to find a way to make that a little softer so we can all live with it, okay? So the first thing is the get behind me. There are two ways to look at it. One is that they're on the road, and Jesus is the rabbi, and he's out front, and Peter has left the pack of disciples and come where he's not supposed to be, and Jesus is not really mad at him. He's just saying, go back where you're supposed to be physically. Okay? Like, go back there where you're supposed to be. And boy, the commentators love that part because it just makes it so different. It's not as rough. The other way to look at it is that this is a direct reprimand to get away from me and stop tempting me. Get behind me so that I'm not in touch with you at all, that I am completely separated from you. Get back there. And that one is powerful in that Jesus is turning his back on the tempter. By the way, if Satan were to show up and you called him that, he wouldn't respond to it. It's not his name. We've given him that name. He doesn't want to be called Satan at all. He's not the adversary, he's the boss. The adversary makes him seem like, to him, if you call him that, then that's like saying he's second fiddle. He's just fighting against something. And he's not, his name is what? Lucifer. He is a very different creature. I mean, all these names, Beelzebub and all that stuff, if he was here and you called him out, he's just not going to answer. And so, they're saying, the scholars say, Jesus is not referring to Peter as Satan, like we think of as the devil, which isn't his name either, by the way, but it's the devil. Unless it's his nickname, and I don't know, but whatever. I like to make fun of him because he's really such an imp, if we think about it. Can I just tell you, he's got bigger fish to fry than me, okay, and us in this room. I'm just saying, he's not here. He's somewhere, but he's a finite creature who cannot be two places at once. He cannot read your mind or speak into your soul. He wants you to believe that because he's the father of lies, and he wants you to believe that he has the same power as God. And he doesn't. Anyway, so they say, well, since the word is adversary, Jesus was just not saying a proper name. He was saying, you adversary to God's will, get behind me. There's a problem with that I couldn't find, and I don't know of a single source, biblical or not, where the word Satan is used for anything other than the person of the devil. And it's used a lot in Mark to mean the devil. Okay? So this is a strong statement. Yeah, it's the adversary, but he's not actually calling Peter the Satan. He's calling him someone who does not have the will of God in his mind at the moment. And he proves that, Jesus proves that by what he says next. He says, you are seeing things merely from a human point of view and not from God's. And that's an okay translation. Here's the deal. What is the human point of view when it comes to the Messiah? It's not a bad point of view. The point of view is that the Messiah will come and conquer the enemy. And the Messiah will free the Jews. from their oppressors, that the Messiah will bring in an age of obedience and worship of God that will bring back the glory of God into the temple. We can go on and on about saying, what is the view of man? And what is the idea of man? That we want to overcome that which keeps us from not being all that we want to be as God's people. That's not a bad thing. But what is the mind of God? The mind of God is that mankind has separated him because of sin. And we have to take care of that problem. And the only way to take care of that problem is through the shedding of the blood of the Son of God and the Son of Man. This is like given, and we have to go through this process to get to the other end so we can have all the great stuff that people want. But God's will is that we have to go through this. And so he says, get behind me, Satan, because you're thinking like men and not like God. And he's just essentially saying, I got tempted like this once before. And can I just say that I don't know that this is true, but I can't imagine. I cannot imagine that just for a moment there wasn't a sense in Jesus' heart. The first time, I can skip an awful lot of horrible stuff by just giving in on this one. And when this one came up, he was just not having it. He had just been very clear about what it meant for him to be there and what it meant for him to come into the suffering that he would have to come into. He knew exactly what was coming. And I'm just saying, this is the stupidest example I have ever given you, but this weekend, I'm a cyclist, and I rode with my daughter, who is an uber cyclist, and I rode with her team for 41 miles, and my wife can tell you that before I went to ride with them, all I thought about was the suffering that I was about to do, and I kept trying to figure out, how can I get out of this? Now let's just jack that up about 1,000 times to suffer in the way that Jesus had to suffer, and to go to the cross, and to the humiliation and all of the other things that he knew were coming. And I cannot imagine he didn't go. He did, didn't he? Lord, please take this cup from me. But what? Not my will, but your will. And we're right there, right here. It's no wonder he said, get behind me. Get behind me. I mean, this is a powerful moment. It's a powerful moment. He doesn't say to Peter, get behind me. You're seeing things from Satan's point of view. He doesn't say that. He says from man's point of view. And I am convinced that Satan and his minions do not understand the gospel at all. And they do not understand what the will of God means and is. They just don't want to have anything to do with it. And so whenever they can latch on to something and they can only figure out what we're doing by watching us. And they'd heard the stories of the Messiah over and over as they watched the Jews talk about it. And so they're latching on to that in order to push against God's will. I don't know what it means, but I got to think about it, because I don't think they're that brilliant. I think they can just copy what they see. They know, can I go off the rail here a minute? They know that they only need three things. They just get us with power, or sex, or possessions. And we fall. Because they've seen us all do that all the time. And so they just keep throwing that at us because it just works. And we do it to ourselves so easily. And so I'm just saying, at this moment, we should not get that worked up about it, because what Jesus is doing is he's saying, don't tempt me this way, Peter. You're tempting me like I got tempted before. I've got something I have to do. And it actually is going to be good for you, Peter, when it's all said and done. And though you, see, the disciples didn't get it at any level. They didn't get it at any level. But how could they have gotten it at any level? Just think about this. If you're going to make up a religion, the last thing you're going to do is have your hero get crucified. I'm just saying. Okay? So there's no way they would have got it. But you know what happened at the end? We all know the end of the story. But we get to the end of this story. Right here, they're all confused. We know what's going on. But when they get there, it goes, okay, now we get it. Now we get it. Now we get it. And then they can talk about it. That's why we don't have so many details in here, because they all know we already know the end of the story. Jesus tells us what's going to happen, but we already know that. Jesus tells Peter to stop it. We don't need the details of that, because we all know that Jesus needed to tell him to stop it. Let's just get moving, because where are we going now? We've already found out who Jesus is. He's the Christ, and he's only got one destination. One. It's the cross. That's where the real book ends. Why? Because Jesus already told us what was going to happen. Boom, boom, boom. And once he's alive, this story's over. And that's why they have all those weird endings about people drinking poison and having snakes bite them and all that stuff. Because they didn't like the ending. They've got to have another ending. So it's added in the 4th century, by the way. So anyway, I think this stuff is really cool. Also, when I start talking about the devil, I just want you to know, I talk about him so you won't worry about him. You don't need to worry about him. We are stupid enough to put bad thoughts in our own head, okay? I'm just putting it out there. When we start blaming him, they just like chalk it up on a board and say, oh, I got credit for something I didn't do. I got credit for something I didn't do. Because they're liars. And they will look at you right in the eye and say, I put that thought in your head. I made you do that. I have power over you. You are my disciple. And they're lying. They're lying. Let's take credit for our own actions, because the only reason we have dignity as creatures is that we are given the responsibility for our own actions. Once you take it away, we have no dignity any longer, because we are somebody else's puppet. And if we are a puppet of someone else, we have no dignity. Don't let them take your dignity away. If you're messing up, say, I'm messing up. Don't blame the devil. Okay? If I get to heaven and find out the devil made me do all this stuff, I'll say, I'm sorry. But in the meantime, I'm not giving him any credit. I'm going to say, it's my fault, and Jesus died to make it possible for me to get over the sin that is my fault and have a relationship with him for eternity. That is the gospel. I'm sorry if I preached at you, but it's like really powerfully important to me. It's made my life very different. And the notes are really good, but they're not, listen to me telling you the notes are. They're appropriate. I just think anytime that I have an opportunity to talk about that, and this gave me an opportunity, it's important, because God's people need to not live in fear. And I know that I said it's possible I'm wrong, but I would rather be wrong underestimating something like the power of the devil than... Now, is he powerful? Absolutely. But do you think he could actually have given the kingdoms of the world to Jesus? Do you think he had the power to give the kingdoms of the world to him? I don't think that he did. We have very little information on him. And most of what we get comes from places like Dante's Inferno and Milton's Paradise Lost. And I'm just going to say, I think Milton was a genius, but he was making it up. He's making it up. He was turning what is very thin into a vast story. He wanted to praise Jesus, but he needed to have a hero. The hero needed to have an anti-hero. And he had to have personality, and he had to have all those things to build an epic. Dante was trying to explain the politics of Italy. If you go into Dante's Inferno, you find that most of the people down there in the levels of hell are people who are against him in the political realm of all things. And so he was trying to create a system that was imaginary and yet gave some kind of fleshed out body to that which we do not understand. And yet, most of their thinking about those things has entered into the culture because they've filled in the gaps that we have in the text. We want to know more about the disciples' lives, and we want to know more about everything in the Bible because the Bible is so narrow in almost everything that it talks about. We get very few details, and we need the details. That's just how we are. Much of the discussion about the character and the nature of the adversary to the kingdom of God comes from us all talking about it. Because we want more details, and we want to make sense of a world that does not make sense. It's very hard to imagine a creature called an angel who has somehow fallen out of grace with God and does not get grace, and I can explain that to you, but it's not in the Bible, and so I don't know whether I'm making it up or not. It makes sense for me, but I'm not going to preach it as God's word. If Satan is the father of lies, and he's called that in the text, then we can count on him lying all the time. And what is he going to lie about the most? Himself. Himself. And I know that Milton said things about him that they can be helpful, but I don't know whether they're true or not. We just have to be really careful to not allow man's imagination to interfere with the reality of trying to live according to that which God has called us to live. And that's just what I'll stop on that. I live in this space. You're all fortunate that you don't. I get paid to think about these things. The things that are beyond that which we see are limited by the power of the God of the universe. And he certainly did not create his own equal. Anyway, on we go. We're at verse 34. Now remember what's just happened, okay? Then, calling the crowds to join his disciples, he said, "If any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross, and follow me. If you hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake and for the sake of the good news, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my message in these adulterous and sinful days, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he returns in the glory of his Father and with the holy angels." Now, can I just tell you that that is one of the most pregnant passages in all of Scripture? That is like crazy loaded. And we need to take our time. So I'm going to talk about a little bit, okay? Because there's so much in this. And a lot of it has to do with the difficulty that we have. And I'll just lay it out here for you. We cannot think about ourselves as anything other than bodies with souls that can be disembodied. Right? When I do a funeral, I've been doing a lot lately, I say this: Charlie's not here anymore. That which you loved about Charlie and made him the person that he is no longer here. He is with God. And that's not biblical. There is no notion in the Bible of a disembodied spirit it's everything in the Old Testament, absolutely in the Old Testament, and even in the New Testament in Jewish thinking, is that we are a unified thing. And then when you see the word soul there, lose your soul, half the time it's translated life, because there's no concept of a life without the body in the Bible. We're going to have to go there, because what Jesus says does not mean anything to us, really, until we get that behind us. Because the truth is, a heaven filled with spirits is not biblical. There's no, and in fact, you know what the difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees was that the Sadducees were the conservatives who only believed in the first 5 books of the Old Testament by Moses, and there's nothing in there about life after death at all. And the difference between them was that the Sadducees, to start with, was that the Sadducees didn't believe anything happened after we died. We just died and disappeared, because that's all they could get from the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And the Pharisees accepted other texts post-Moses, and they started to believe in what? Resurrection from the dead. Why? Because they saw things in the passages from David and from the prophets that talked about the fact that we would be alive at another time. But their notion of resurrection at the time of Jesus was that we would rise in our bodies, and we would never be separated as a soul from our bodies. Resurrection is always about body, soul together. We even have divided ourselves up into soul, spirit, and body. There's nothing in the Bible that says we are eternally souled. Nothing. I'm just saying, we have to talk about that next week. So off we go. It says, then calling the crowd to join the disciples. This is a shock. We thought they were all by themselves. We thought that the 12 disciples were talking to Jesus and it was just them, and that Peter took him off the side. Well, guess what? You're never alone when you're in the Bible times. I mean, anytime it says somebody is by themselves, it means there are people around. There's no way that Jesus could have been walking around wherever they were at the moment and people not recognize who he was. Remember, it's a guy with a group of guys following him around. And the people on the road are going, what's this? And they go, oh, we're following Jesus. And they go, we've heard about him. And they run up the road and they tell their cousin, or they tell their mom, or they tell their neighbor, that Jesus dude that we've heard about is here. And pretty soon there's a crowd. And so Jesus turns from the disciples, because this is really important right here, what happens. What he's going to do, he's going to start talking about what it is to absolutely be a follower of Jesus. And he's going to open up the context so that he's not just talking to the 12. He's not just saying, if you 12 guys want to follow me, you need to do this. He opens it up to the world and includes whom? Us. And so this now becomes our question to answer. Are we willing to do this? Are we willing to be this person? He says, if any of you wishes, it's an interesting word, but anyway, to be my disciple, that's just follower of me. Now, it says here, you must give up your own way. Can I just say that is one of the nicest translations of a Greek word I've ever found. Because it doesn't say give up your own selfish way, it says in my Bible. It actually says, the word means, and there it is, it means anyone who is willing, he must renounce himself It means to have a complete and utter disconnection from yourself. We're talking about giving up any right to speak about your own destiny, your own purpose, what it is that gives you being. Your being becomes, I am a disciple of Jesus. The cross, crucifixion, was the most humiliating form of death. I'll just put it out there. Jesus died quickly. Jesus died quickly because he didn't die from being crucified. He died from bleeding to death because they beat him to death by causing him to bleed so terribly that he gave his blood, which holds our life, and he died on a cross, but he did not die from crucifixion. Crucifixion is a bloodless death, by the way. And they figured out, aren't those Romans smart? They figured out 3 places on your body you could drive a nail through somebody and they wouldn't bleed much. And they'd hang there for days and days and days. Why? Because they were billboards for what you shouldn't do. That's why they nailed little signs over them that said what they did. Do not steal pigs from the Roman army auxiliary pig sties. We'll kill you. That's what they hung them up like that. And they have little things under their feet so they could raise themselves up, because you know how you died when you were crucified? You suffocated. When your strength gave out, you suffocated. Here's another reason that Jesus did not die from crucifixion, because that would have been a death that was not dignified. His life would have still been in his body, because your life is in your blood. He had to die by giving his life, which is his blood. If he'd have died from suffocation, he would have died by, as we're told, we can't even, in the Old Testament, we can't even kill animals that way. We're not allowed to kill animals. We're not allowed to boil them in their own mother's milk. Why? Because they die with their blood in them, and we have not shown them any dignity when we take their life. If you had a certain level of social standing, they could not crucify you. This was for the low of the lows. And there was a thing, and it's called taking up your cross. That's the way of the cross. It's absolutely a thing, and what it was when somebody got convicted of a capital crime and they were going to crucify them, they would put the cross beam on their shoulders and make them carry it from the place where they were convicted out to the location where they were going to. What they would do is they would lay them down and nail them. It's through here, too, by the way. When it's in, the stigmatas are wrong. It's here. It's here. And it's in your feet turned so that there's no blood. They go between the bones. They would nail them down, and then they would put ropes on them, and they would drag them up and slam them up against a post, and then bang that post into the crossbeam and lash it up like that, okay? The way of the cross, or to carry your cross, was the space between when they put that bar on your shoulders and you had to walk, and most of the people that got that were poor criminals, and they had been thieves, or they had been something that they were going to be killed for. And the people would gather along and humiliate them and spit on them and yell things at them and everything. And the carrying your cross was that space of great humiliation out to where you're going to die. We've lost all that. The Romans stopped using this way of killing people in the 2nd century. And once they stopped killing people with it, it became a metaphor. I am tired of hearing people saying, well, that's just your cross to bear. Stop it. You don't know what you're saying. That's a picture of something that's just a difficulty. I'm making this up. This is not true. My mother-in-law does not make me mad as my cross to bear. The cross to bear is that you identify with the death of Jesus and you are humiliated by the world as you go out to what? Die. If you want to be his follower, can you imagine what it meant? Everybody that heard Jesus say this at that moment he said it knew exactly what he was talking about. And it wasn't that we'd have to have some difficulties in life. It was that you had to go through humanity in great humiliation and die. That's what he's talking about. It's not easy. He says, in their world, the option of death was a strong one. We don't feel that. We don't feel it. There's one, I have it in the notes, there's one Roman ruler in Syria at the time put 2,000 Jews to death for something. It became a game to the Romans to kill people by crucifixion. There is nothing in our culture that is the same. I can't even think it up to say, if Jesus had said, and if you're going to follow me, you have to do this. There's nothing that we would go, oh, my word, there's no way I'm going to do that. And he's saying, think about it. Because why? He has just said, what? He's just said that the Messiah must suffer and then be crucified and die and then rise again. Now, to us, that's a hopeful statement. To them, rising from the dead is like, well, yeah, there's that possibility in the long haul, but that just doesn't sound like a very good idea right now. I have been moved utterly by this passage, and we'll get more into it next time. But this is such important stuff. Because, it's like when people get offered salvation, we offer them to be followers of Jesus so that their businesses will work out better. Jesus doesn't call us to that. He calls us to be willing on the front end, willing at the beginning to die. To die. And then we can start talking about other stuff. That's what Jesus said. Why? Because it's a serious thing. It's a serious thing to follow Jesus. Okay, thanks. Okay, I'll see you next week.